brightest minds who comment on international affairs, on global affairs. We have with us Dhruva Jayashankar. He heads the Observer Research Foundation in Washington, D.C. We have Elizabeth Braw, who's with the American Enterprise Institute, Shubhalay Majumdar, who's with the MacDonald Laurier Institute. He's a monk scholar over there. I have with me my super bright colleague Trisha Ray, who's a tech specialist, and of course Rajeshwari Rajagopalan, my senior colleague, who's an all-zone star. I mean, she just can take on anything and everything. And then I have Kabir Taneja, our Middle East expert. Mitali Mukherjee, she's with the Observer Research Foundation on Economic Affairs. And we will be joined by others very soon, and I will introduce them to you as soon as they join us. This discussion will be live streaming on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and we hope people will join in to listen to the discussion and your views over here. Let me begin with Dhruva Jayashankar. Dhruva, can you just quickly update us? What is the latest? I mean, it's very confusing. And sitting here in India, of course, it's all the more confusing because this is not how we conduct our elections. Our results would have been out by lunchtime.
Yes. So I think let me start off by explaining that the U.S. is a very decentralized system, and from its foundation in the 18th century has been very focused on the rights of individual states, and so even the conduct of elections is really a state matter. So there's immense variation in the rules about regulation from state to state and how they're counted. And largely for that reason, we're seeing different results coming at different times, some of which are play in favor of one candidate, some of which play in favor of another candidate. Where do things stand right now? This is the morning after the election. And at this point, it is effectively undecided what the overall outcome would be. One thing is quite clear, which is I think those who had been hoping for a Joe Biden sweep, a Democratic sweep, have been significantly disappointed. It has been much closer than pollsters and others had anticipated. The two surprises last night, one is that Florida, which was a key swing state that Donald Trump had to win, went in his favor. I think that's quite clear. And overall, the numbers were much better for him than many had anticipated. The only consolation for Joe Biden is that Arizona, a state that he had been hoping to win away from Republicans, did seem to have gone that way, and the Senate race there also seems to have gone in favor of the Democrats. That's been the only major silver lining for Democrats. The other key races are all hanging in the balance, and Republicans seem to have done better both in the presidential races and in the House and Senate congressional races there in Iowa, Ohio, which have gone Republican. But at this point of time, basically we're awaiting results from about 7 states which are hanging in the balance, some of which are leaning in favor of the Democrats, Wisconsin and Arizona. Some of which are leaning in favor of Republicans, North Carolina and Georgia. It may just come down to the 3 key Midwestern states that Trump surprisingly won 4 years ago, that are Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. These 3 states may not, the final tally may not be counted for a number of days. So we may be in for a very long and litigious battle between the 2 sides to resolve the outcome of this presidential election.
Continue, you're muted.
Dhruva, on the House and Senate tally, the latest report suggests that it's a tie in both Senate and the House. So there is no clear edge for anybody.
Yes, again, so far there's nobody has crossed the 50% mark in either the Senate or the House. Democrats have picked up 2 Republican Senate seats, and the Republicans have picked up 1 Democratic seat. So it's gotten 1 in favor. But for the Democrats to seize control of the Senate, they will need another 2 to 3 more wins, and those are still hanging in the balance. And again, in some cases, the Republican incumbents are doing better than had been expected in the polls. The House, so far, again, as of this morning, the Democrats have dropped 4 seats relative to 2016, but they still have enough overall to get a majority. So that seems to be less in question, but the Senate balance is very, very slim at this point.
Yeah, House seems to be quite clear. It's 188, 181 as of now. But it has, I mean, there's this overall suggestion that it's a very messy affair. Raji, you had some very strong views. I mean, democracy can be messy, but it still remains the best option.
Yeah, absolutely. I think despite the flaws of the American elections that we have seen so far and the outcome, which is still not clear, I think you still need to weigh in the positives of the democracies as a system of governance, because you have a lot of the authoritarian and other forms of government, and some of our own neighbors are trying to popularize that as a more efficient form of government. So I would say that democracy, even though it might be loud, it might be chaotic, it might be problematic in many ways, but I think the advantages, the benefits of having the people have a voice at the end of the day, and I think that needs to be respected, and that's something that I would still respect, and say that democracy is still any day a better form of governance than going the other way around, in a sense.
Dhruva, there's some violence happening in Washington, D.C. I think the riot police is out. How sort of real is this fear of widespread violence sort of consuming most of America?
So, even during the Black Lives Matter protests, which were quite violent, they spread to over 100 cities and towns across the country earlier this summer. It was still mostly relegated to urban areas, and a few urban areas were particularly badly hit by it, particularly retail stores and business. Right now, it seems as in anticipation of potential unrest, you saw shops boarded up in Washington, in New York, and other places. Some of it still seems to be precaution. We still have to see what happens in the next few days. But it does seem like local authorities have taken a lot of precautions against the possibility of unrest. Again, I don't anticipate that this will be, even if it is very hotly disputed, that it'll be widespread violence. But I think we'll have to see what happens in the next few days.
But do you think the violence which preceded the elections, that sort of contributed to a larger number of people coming out and voting? 67% polling, which I don't think has happened in recent times.
I mean, it's hard to say what we will. I think people will be going over the exit polls and other survey data for months, perhaps years, following this election. So we don't really know what the motivating factors for a lot of people were. Turnout was extraordinarily high this election, which traditionally would have favored the Democrats. They're the ones who've been wanting to, get more votes in. But again, there were some surprises. The high voter turnout in Florida and Texas actually looks like it favored the Republicans, if anything. Certain groups that had traditionally voted Democrat, particularly, for example, some Hispanics in Florida seem to have switched Republican. Again, a lot of this has defied some expectations on that front. Not so much. I mean, everything, with the exception possibly of Florida, everything so far seems to be within the margin of error. But I would say overall, Republicans will be much more satisfied with the outcomes that we've seen so far relative to the polls beforehand compared to Democrats.
So let me be a bit provocative here. Raji, media, liberal media, and pollsters have horribly failed in predicting this election.
Sure. Absolutely. No, I think first, I think last election is in 2016 itself, there was a sense that polls were going wrong, but then they were both mostly national polls and there were not that many state level polls. So there was that assumption that you were missing out that complete picture because you did not have that state level polls. But this time you had a number of state polls, partisan polls, and so on and so forth, but yet the polls have gone completely, other way around. In fact, even some of the more credible websites that have been talking about put it at around 90-10 Biden Trump, and they just 10% for chances for Trump, but that's clearly they have gone off the mark in a sense. So way off the mark. So it's very difficult to now. I think like Dhruva said, I think there will be a lot many more studies looking into the what are the kind of pitfalls of doing these exit polls. And I think this time it has been much more complicated in a sense because you have mail-in ballots, you have early voting, you have in-person voting. So multiple factors have contributed to possible the failure of the sort of a predictability factor when it comes to exit polls. So it has been a much bigger challenge as far as exit polls are concerned because of the COVID-induced challenges that have come this way.
Trisha, there was also this election also brought forth a very deep-rooted bias in social media platforms. They were almost participating in the political process, and which is not really good for democracies around the world. It's intrusive.
I mean, the jury's still out on whether the way Twitter and Facebook have gone about very proactively labeling content in the lead up to the election, whether it's going to be something that's effective as a model for other elections. That said, one interesting development from last week, for instance, was this is something that kind of got lost in the election news cycle, was there was another congressional hearing on the big tech companies, Twitter, Facebook, Google. And there's while Republicans and Democrats seem to be aligned on the fact that there is a need to regulate these platforms, the motives are very different on both sides. On the Republican side, most of the statements by senators and questions to the three CEOs were on the suppression of right-wing speech, the labeling of tweets by the president as misinformation or misleading. But on the Democrat side, the primary concern was regarding the spread of extremist content, of radicalization through social media. And so while the Republicans are calling for lesser moderation or at least more transparent moderation of content, Democrats are calling for heavier moderation of content. So that's one interesting way in which this debate has also played out.
Right. We have with us Theresa Fallon she's the director at the Center for Russian, European, and Asian Studies. Theresa, how do you see Russia reacting or responding to the emerging possible scenario in America after the elections? You have to unmute yourself.
Okay. A warm hello from Brussels. Thank you for that question. I think we really do have to wait and see what the outcome of this is. We've seen, Russia and China are there's been a lot of speculation about which president they would prefer. We've seen a lot of sentiment, Trump and Putin. But the key question, I think, now for Russia as well as China, especially for Russia, is how the U.S.-China relations will go, because we're seeing Russia pretty much becoming a smaller and smaller vassal in some respects. And I think that Putin is keenly watching this election and the outcome. It seems that Europeans are getting tired of attempts to even have a reset with Russia. I think that if it is Biden or Trump, I think that will be very, very difficult to do. So as China becomes far more assertive during this pandemic period, they see it as an opportunity. I think if I was in Putin's shoes right now, I would be very, very concerned. So let's see how the election turns out. But I think Putin's really in a difficult position with either president right now.
Elizabeth, would you like to comment on that, on how Europe is going to react or how Europe is responding to the way this election is turning out? I mean, it's not a Biden sweep. The Democrats are not coming back with a big majority, at least. What does it mean?
Well, thank you for that question, and it's a pleasure to join you all. So I'm here in London. I previously lived in the US on both coasts, and my in-laws live in one of those states that Drew mentioned earlier, where votes are still being counted. So I'll be watching very keenly to see who wins that state, which is Michigan. It's interesting. This morning, when I woke up, everybody on Twitter was all of a sudden an expert in U.S. elections, and lots of people were writing, "Well, Europe got this completely wrong," and I sort of wanted to say, actually, Europe is not one voice. There are lots of voices here, and if they have learned anything, if policymakers have learned anything since the last election, and they knew this before, but they got it a bit wrong in the last election, is you can't put all your bets on one horse, or in this case, one presidential candidate. And so it's not like European decision makers and ordinary Europeans were all assuming that Biden would win. Actually, policymakers were quite aware that Trump could win, and so now I think it's that sort of a bet on both was a wise choice, which is what happens in every election. I don't know any diplomats who would openly just go with one candidate and hope that he or she will win. But regardless of who wins, there is this whole legacy of the past 4 years, and if it's Trump who is eventually elected, it will be 4 very difficult years. But even if it's not, it's clear that most European leaders would have wanted somebody other than Biden other than Trump over the past 4 years. Now Biden will have to undo some of what they consider to have been damaged to the transatlantic relationship, and so it is a very fraught relationship. And if I may just add one thing, the only beneficiary of that is China. And I think we can be pretty sure that the Chinese government will step in and position itself as the partner of choice, the stable partner to the EU and to European countries individually. And it was interesting to see that Huawei tweeted this morning that whatever happens, we are your partner, something like that. And so if even Huawei has spotted this, you can be sure that the Chinese government will exploit this opening.
Shubaloy, do you think that's the way it will happen in transatlantic affairs, irrespective of who wins, and more so supposing if Biden were to move in?
You know, I think on so many levels we are seeing a completely disrupted world, and it's set in the context of major political realignments across the Middle East, across the Indo-Pacific, and in Europe, which has already been undergoing a period of disarray and great disruption. And so when you think about how North America or the United States would be engaging Europe, we are looking at a European Union that is fractured, dealing with the question of Brexit, major pressures in the European South and East from a variety of different conflicts. We are seeing mainland Europe struggling with its own position around whether to treat China as a partner in prosperity or as a security threat. And as you migrate further toward the eastern flank of NATO or Eastern Europe, we are seeing the active attempt by Russia to wage hybrid warfare, information operations, to try and find ways to destabilize the concept of Europe. And so when you think about the structural relationships of what any administration is going to have to deal with in Washington after the period of elections that Dhruva so well articulated, you're going to have a different type of concept of what the American national interest is, of what the international order will be, and what partnerships would actually be successful in that. And so in that context, I do believe that European disarray is a problem not just for Europeans, it's a problem for American, Canadian, and other policymakers, and it will require a reimagining of how interests are expressed, whether it is a re-elected Trump or a newly elected President Biden.
Dhruva, we'll come back to China in detail later on. But a quick comment from you. Both Theresa and Elizabeth have mentioned China, that this election will also, the results of this election will also see China recalibrating its responses, repositioning itself. And how does it play out either way, whether Biden wins or Trump retains?
Well, look, I think we'll have to see so the third element to that question is not just whether Biden or Trump wins, but also how messy the transition is to in the next few months. Look, I think there is a realization across party lines amongst elites in the US that the great competition, international competition today is coming from China, and it's in every possible domain, military, economic. Trade, employment, technology. You take multilateral institutions, take any area now, and there's a more and more of a direct confrontation between the U.S. and China. I think this will depend on ultimately what will matter in terms of the U.S. response. So there's two things. One is U.S. capabilities, whether it can, it'll have the political cohesion, it'll have the economic strength, to survive. And on this, I think, in some ways, politics is, I wouldn't say irrelevant, but it's less relevant in the sense that, the U.S. economy will chug along. U.S. innovation will largely develop in a certain way, with only minor changes based on public policy changes, such as, for example, immigration, changes to immigration, or how much investment is put into R&D, institutional investment. But I think the other question then is whether the U.S. leadership will have the will to take on China on many issues. And in the past, this has been somewhat in question, for example, in the South China Sea. So, I think these are really the two questions. Will the U.S. come out of this structurally stronger or not? And will whoever the leader, whatever the composition of the leadership going forward, will they have the political will and appetite to take on competition with China in a meaningful way? And on this, I think it's not just the outcome of the presidential election. Even you can see scenarios under both the second Trump presidency and a potential Biden presidency, where there will be competing pressures to take on a more competitive approach to China, or whether to find areas of cooperation and try to dampen that competition. So again, I'm not sure it's clear at this point of time if it will play out one way, even if we were to know the outcome of the election.
Trisha, any comments on Huawei reassuring Europe that we are with you?
Well, I mean,
especially since most of Europe has rejected Huawei.
yes, I mean, it's just messaging ultimately. But I will say that in terms of the two presidential candidates' stances on tech and China, they're not very different, honestly. They both emphasize, in different names, an America First approach, making localizing supply chains for critical tech, including semiconductors. And so in that space, honestly, there isn't much difference, and I don't see any substantial change should one or the other get elected.
Yeah, Raji, you wanted to say something? You need to switch
just a couple of quick points. So we talk about so much of the messy problem that is unfolded in the US. Of course, I think there is messiness. One, it comes from the fact that you don't have a clear outcome, as was the case until a few elections ago, in a sense. So that's one part of the problem. That the fact that it will take another few days for the results to come in. That's one set of issue. Second, of course, the polls have gone completely off the mark, and so it thrown out off the mark your own assumptions and expectations implications of what would play out in the coming days. But to me, I think the bigger point is what does this, because any president, whether it's a Trump 2.0 or if it's a Biden presidency, there is so much of polarization within America, politically and socially. So how any administration that is going to take over will have to do a lot of work in terms of consolidating the society and the polity. So how is that? So is the US going to be so involved, looking inward in a sense? That is number one. So how does that affect the US international standing? And second, how does that play out in the Indo-Pacific? Because this is a critical time in terms of the changing power balance and so on and so forth. So having a clear and decisive US leadership is so important. But at the same time, given the possible inward looking of a possible administration, how does that affect the US standing in globally, but also in the Pacific, how that's going to play out? I think those are a couple of important things that I would be keen to look out in a sense.
Yeah, we will be coming to Indo-Pacific and India and the region. Elizabeth, you wanted to add something?
Okay.
I unmuted myself and muted myself, apparently. Just on the point that you just made. So it's remarkable, I think, how social media has changed the way in which we perceive reality. So I can tell based on my own social media use, I had a particular perception of what was about to happen, and that didn't happen. And I think the same is true for all of us. And so what does it mean for democracy, not just in the US, but now especially painfully in the US, I think, when social media has helped us create cocoons around us where we hear only what we want to hear, not because we want to isolate ourselves from the world. It's just we follow people and connect with people online who think similar things for the most part. And so countries are often divided anyway between those who have benefited from globalization and those who have not. And if we have further fragmentation based on social media use and what we see and hear on social media, then it's incredibly dangerous. And if I may just add, in a previous life, I was a technology correspondent based in San Francisco. And in 2007, I often visited startups. In 2007, I went to visit yet another startup, and it was a few guys, and as is always the case, they had their bikes at their desk, and it was a warehouse, and it was all so very casual, and it was about 10 guys, as I recall, and you, if you were a journalist, you just emailed info@thiscompany.com, and one of the founders emailed you back, which is what happened to me. And that company was Twitter. Now, Twitter, we can't imagine this presidential campaign or the impact now, the post-election debate, without Twitter. So I'll just hand the floor back over to you, but I just wanted to put that in.
Thank you. Mithali and Dhruva, could you quickly share your thoughts on whether, whatever the outcome, and especially if Mr. Trump were to remain or retain the presidency, how does it impact trade, and especially US-India trade issues that have been pending for some time?
Kanchan, Teresa has been trying to get your attention as well.
Yeah, I'll just come back. I'll just come back to Teresa. Sorry, I missed it.
First, and then would you like to jump in?
It's to pick up on a couple of comments.
Yeah, please, Teresa.
Huawei and Europe. I just wanted to point out that because of the UK, they had the golden era, the perceived golden era with China, and because they've left the EU, they're far more nimble on their feet. So they were able to do a complete turnaround, and unexpectedly, that's had an echo effect on the continent. So we've seen, you have the EU, you have Brexit, but with the UK outside, that echo effect has really impacted the continent. So we've seen France and Germany sitting on the fence waiting for the election to see which way they're going to go. But with a Trump administration that has largely been disinterested in the EU until the very, very last, few yards of the election, we saw Pompeo coming over to Europe, having multiple meetings, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. And we've seen a kind of an evolution of the Trump administration, understanding that we really do need allies. And so it was the Europeans that asked for the special EU-China meeting. I'm sorry, EU-US meeting dialogue on China. And so it's kind of an interesting result of, with Trump kind of hands off on Europe, that Europe has kind of evolved in their own way and have decided, man, we really need to get closer to the United States. So I would say that even though Germany is kind of sitting on the fence in regard to Huawei, and they're one of the key issues, we're seeing German defense minister right now in Australia. She announced the Indo-Pacific cooperation. We had last month, we had the enunciation of German's Indo-Pacific guidelines. They don't want to call it a strategy, but I would say that a year ago, I was in Berlin for a conference, and there was great discussion about sending a German ship to the South China Sea. And I was all excited. I thought, I've been working on this for like 20 years, and finally the Germans are going to, do something important. It never happened a year ago, and instead they had an exercise with the PLA in Bavaria for pandemic. That was, a year ago. So it was a third PLA exercise that the German military did with the PLA. So I was a bit discouraged, disappointed, feeling rather cynical that this would never happen. But the fact that it's kind of baby steps, but you couldn't even say the term Indo-Pacific in Brussels. 2 years ago, I organized a conference on the Indo-Pacific, and European officials were canceling at the very last minute because they got the word they were not allowed to speak at an Indo-Pacific conference. So now the fact that the Germans are even using that term, which I think is really good because it makes psychologically Europeans feel that this region is much closer to them. When you just talk about Asia-Pacific, for Europeans it makes it seem so far away. So kind of crafting this Indo-Pacific narrative, it doesn't dovetail with the US narrative on the Indo-Pacific, but I think that it's a positive move. But on the other hand, the downside is, Europeans for the last 2 decades have been underspending on defense. And so really, what can they do? The US cannot fight a two-front war. And so Europeans have not been preparing. And it's kind of an albatross around the US defense planners' necks. They can make these nice, kind of symbolic gestures of being interested in the Indo-Pacific. But at the end of the day, they're not really able to take care of their own neighborhood. And we're seeing a more and more conflicted, contested neighborhood that the Europeans are in. So I think that that transatlantic relations have really been put on the back burner. And I would hope that even if it is a Trump administration, I think that they do understand that they need to work with allies. I think that there is this evolving understanding that we saw at the very last stages, like the Hail Mary pass of the election. And if Biden wins, it's been very clear that he wants to work with allies and work very closely with allies. So, the other key issue, I think, for this is dual use controls, because the US has this, it's difficult to send high-tech equipment to China, but we're having a lot of difficulty with European allies to, because there's money involved, and in a post-pandemic, post-COVID-19 economic landscape, it will be very difficult for some countries to, forego those types of economic benefits. So we really need to get the Europeans on board. Let's not forget when they were building 7 artificial islands in the South China Sea, it was a German company and a Belgian company that leased the gigantic dredgers that helped them build the islands. So I think even during the Obama administration, we saw this type of tech transfer. You don't think of a dredger as a tech transfer, but it really changed the strategic landscape of the region. And Huawei is very good about messaging, but I think that I think there's a growing understanding in Europe that even if you're a member of NATO, you have to have secure communications. And if your country is using Huawei, this will be a problem. So I think that Huawei is very smart about, making tweets and things like that. But I think that they're really under a great deal of pressure and lobbying very hard. And I don't think they're going to give up. Even though some countries,
Let's
they want
see how it happens.
Okay.
Dhruva and Mitali, quickly, how do you see it impacting trade? Global trade, but more specifically US-India trade?
Okay, so that's a long answer, Kanchan, but I will try to make this brief and concise. I want to just contextualize first what's happening in terms of finance and economy. Markets generally hate uncertainty, so this is the worst kind of mess that they could have got. You will notice some nervousness happening in the Dow futures at this point, and that's likely going to filter through over the next couple of days on other global markets. I am a bit amused though, Kanchan, with how the panel is quite clear about how China is sitting back and laughing about this, because I don't know if it is that simple. As we speak, the Chinese yuan is actually plummeting to historic lows. So the Chinese as well feel quite nervous about this situation, and their financial markets are reacting to it. In terms of trade, Kanchan, very briefly, trade ties between India and China have actually been doing extremely well, and that has been regardless of who's being the leader or which party was in power. So just to give you a number, from 2000 to 2018, trade ties between India and US have actually increased 7.5 times. So there is a lot of depth in terms of our trade ties. If we're looking for more in terms of greater migration of our skilled workers to there, that's not going to happen.
We are looking for an agreement. We are looking for a trade agreement.
I don't think the trade agreement is going to be on the table for either party, Kanchan, because what's happened through the pandemic is that the Democrats and the Republicans have actually become more aligned about the fact that there is a trade enemy, which is China. So if you notice, the narrative before Trump came to power was, this is the country we need to be in dialogue with. I don't think that is the case anymore, even for Biden. So I'm not sure trade agreement is going to happen like that. Trump has been quite specific about what his concerns are with India. I see this as a relationship that continues to stay quite strong, but not necessarily producing the the bumper results that you allude to. But I'm sure Dhruva has more to say about that.
Dhruva, what's the view from DC?
Far from me. No, I'd rather. I think they captures things very well. Just a few thoughts, and there's somewhat paradoxical developments taking place. So on the one hand, even under the Trump administration, prior to the coronavirus pandemic, we actually saw an increase in U.S.-India bilateral trade, which again was sort of overshadowed by sometimes the rather public spats over trade issues. The overall trade figures actually increased. And the trade deficit which the US had with India narrowed, largely due to trade in US exports in energy, in defense, and a few other sectors. So there's really a few sectors that were driving this. At the same time, of course, we had the two countries apply tariffs against each other, the suspension of special trading privileges for India by the US. And a real emphasis on narrowing those trade deficits. This seemed to be what the Trump administration wanted to prioritize. In the event of his re-election, I think we'll see a continued emphasis on those trade deficits, not necessarily trade. But I think we can, in a post-coronavirus pandemic world, global economy, I don't think the expectations that we will see an acceleration in the overall goods trade, merchandise trade between the US and the rest of the world. The real sort of nature of commerce will in fact, I think, be quite different, and will really move into areas of high technology, where the US will continue to see India as a source of labor and a source of as a partner in innovation. So again, I think there will be again for a variety of structural factors, and this will happen even under Democrats. There'll still be this very heated discussions on the minutiae of goods.
If Biden were to make it, do you see an easing on visa issues?
So he has publicly stated that. He has publicly said that he will raise the cap on H-1B visas for Indians, that it'll make it easier for green card people to attain green cards through professional means. So he has publicly said that. Whether he can carry, I'm still skeptical that we'll see comprehensive immigration reform in the US, because there are multiple voices, even amongst the Democrats, some of whom would like the status quo effectively to remain. So there's comprehensive immigration reform is going to be very messy no matter who wins. But in terms of executive orders, a Biden administration will be more amenable to what India and Indian companies have sought.
Moving away from trade and other China, etc., Kabir, a young author of a book on the ISIS, and he's a resident Middle East expert. Kabir, how do you see the Middle East uh, situation changing if Biden were to come in, or if Trump were to retain the presidency?
Thanks, Sanjita. I think the some capitalists, at least some capitals in the Gulf, at least, would be delighted if Trump won again. If you see the way they have treated Trump and they have behaved around Trump, it has worked out very well for them. Iran is going to be critical and central as it is for the Gulf, and Trump shares a similar view and disdain of Tehran at the same time. I think they were at some level dreading the sort of Obama era coming back with Biden, where the Arab Spring got sort of some sort of push from sort of American hands-offness on the issue. I remember during the Arab Spring, Obama was also the president that told Twitter not to go into service and shut down service for some time because of the protests happening. So Trump has been great for them. If you see just a very quick example of someone like MBS, who's in line to come into power in Riyadh, and see the Khashoggi incident, where Trump openly said, according to a report, that he saved MBS's rear as far as the Khashoggi incident was concerned. So I think for places like Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, even Doha, for example, Trump would be a great return to DC, specifically against Biden, which would put brakes on issues such as the UAE getting F-35s, for example, which they have been aiming for since the Abraham Accords have been signed. Of course, Iran is a country that is again going to figure in midst of all of this. I'm sure the strict nature of the Trump administration against Iran is going to continue, which is a problem for Delhi as well till a certain extent. But of course, it is manageable. But I think one of the critical areas that is going to be
a quick question to you, Kabir. Do you think a Biden administration would still continue with providing F-35s to a country that was off the list till now?
I think they will delay it. I don't think they're going to be very forthcoming on that issue because I mean, of course, even Israel has said at a certain level that they're okay. But we saw what Israel wants in return. They have pitched to get the F-22, for example, which the Americans have never exported. Now that export could have happened could happen under Trump. It's definitely, I don't think, going to happen under Biden. So a country such as the UAE, for example, would get those jets only if Israel maintains its military edge in some shape or form. And that is going to get very complicated if Biden comes to power.
So it's a sort of a catch-22 situation, because Israel would expect America to honor its part of the deal, and there is always this iffiness about a democratic administration that they may not deliver on what was promised by the Republicans. I will open up a brief discussion on Iran. All of you, whoever wishes to come in on it, on how you see U.S.-Iran relations unfolding in the post-2020 election scenario. Will you see the hardening of positions? If a Biden presidency comes in, will there be a review that happens? What happens then? Anyone, please. It's open to all.
Okay, No, if it's Trump 2.0, I think there is more of a continuity that as far as the Iran question is concerned, in a sense. But if a Biden administration were to come in, there is going to be significant changes. One big change being the Iran nuclear deal and how the U.S. wants to be part of the deal and how they want to sort of bring in Iran as an important stakeholder in this whole business. I think that would have been because I have always been critical of the U.S. That Iran nuclear deal. I have not been particular because I thought that the U.S. and Europe could have actually bargained a much tougher deal, but the Iranians are known for negotiating. They will tire you out, and so they exactly really managed to get a great deal for themselves. But if a Biden administration were to sort of show that keenness and great interest in sort of bringing that Iranian nuclear deal back and the U.S. being an active part of it, then the Iranians are going to seek even further bargains and gain even further than what they've already done in a sense, because especially on a number of different clauses, the Iranians stand to gain as of now. So I think one significant change that I see is in terms of the Iran nuclear deal that is going to change the equations quite significantly for the Iran.
Chola, any views on that?
I agree with that largely. I think that the positions between the Democrats and the Republicans are perhaps most stark on the issue of Iran, and even more widely in the Middle East. The Democratic position over the Obama administration, which Biden represented in this new campaign, a consistent perspective from the Obama administrations, took traditional allies in the Gulf and Israel and placed those interests and priorities second in favor of pursuing negotiations with Iran, being soft on Assad in Syria, et cetera, et cetera. What I think is interesting is that they would continue the strong bilateral relationship between the United States and Israel, but geopolitically on matters of security or cooperation, the Biden administration would be populated by many of the Obama era policymakers, making what I would suggest are major strategic errors in that region. The Trump administration's policy of maximum pressure has seen tangible results in realigning the Middle East through what Kabir had mentioned earlier in the emergence of the Abraham Accords, which is a truly historic deal that creates a new bedrock for cooperation on security, on commerce, that will become increasingly visible between Israel and its Gulf partners. It is not just a short-term anti-Iran transaction, it is a long-term relationship that is emerging right now. And I think it puts the region and a particular actor of the region in a pretty isolated position. And that's one country we have yet to talk about, which is Turkey. And in this, I think, it'll be very interesting to see if President Biden, if he gets elected, what his tack would be on Erdogan. My suspicion, based on what he has described in presentations to editorial boards, is that he actually might be a bit tougher on Erdogan than can be traditionally expected in a position of how he would challenge Erdogan's relationships with Iran and elsewhere. The Turkish-Iranian-Qatari partnership is certainly something that he would have to respond to in this new Middle East context.
I will ask Dhruva also to chip in on that. But before that, Elizabeth and Teresa, if you could please share quick comments on Europe's perception on dealing with Iran and how that could get realigned in the event of a Biden victory, or how it could change if Trump were to remain.
I can start. So I completely agree with what both my colleagues said earlier. And the irony of the U.S. leaving the Iran deal is that it leaves a really sort of an odd coalition of European countries and Russia trying to figure out a way of salvaging it by working with Iran. And so the US has really been the outlier and sort of completely on its own in its opposition to this deal. And I think it may it may seem completely obvious to the Trump administration that that's the policy that should be pursued, but it doesn't seem obvious to anybody else. And yes, we all agree that the Iran nuclear deal could have been better, as you said earlier. But I think we all also agree that it was good enough, and it was better to have it than not to have it. So it seems to be consensus among everybody, including a potential Biden administration, that it's better to have it than not to have it. And then I can't remember who mentioned Turkey earlier, but I completely agree on that. Turkey is Erdogan is such a clever tactician, and he is at the moment the only one who can stand up to Putin. But it could be that he has overextended himself, and then has challenges on too many fronts now, and so that's his challenge, and not an insignificant one.
Teresa?
All right, just quick comments. Since Federica Mogherini, the former High Rep of the EU, is no longer, this was something that she felt was really on her shoulders, so she was pushing very hard. And the perception in Europe is that the Trump administration pulled out of the JCPOA, they pulled out of the Paris climate talks. This really put, as Elizabeth said, an odd coalition. So it put Europe and China on the same side. And so I think if the Biden if there's a Biden presidency, this will be removing two major problems for cooperation with the Europeans. So I think that this would be a very positive thing. Biden has said that he would rejoin JCPOA and the Paris Climate Agreement, which today actually comes into force, that the US is leaving. So I think that that would be a positive sign. The Europeans would see that as a very positive development. In regard to Turkey, it is creating this existential crisis for NATO. I mean, Europe has a lot of problems, and this is something that they don't even know. How do you get rid of a member of NATO? They don't even have that in the rule book. So it's very, I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying that there are comments like that in Europe that you hear in Brussels. So I think that Turkey is a huge challenge, and the neighborhood that Europe is in, let alone thinking about the Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, it's becoming far more complex for them. And we even have various European member states on different sides in the situation in the Eastern Med. So I think Europe really has a lot of troubles ahead, and what they do need is closer cooperation with the Transatlantic Alliance, is my view. Thanks.
Dhruva, I will just come back to you. Mithali wanted to chip in on trade and commerce vis-a-vis India and US post-elections. Yes, Mithali, go ahead.
No, Kanchan, I didn't have a specific point about that, but I did have to, I mean, I think I would like to just sort of, set this conversation in terms of, what can we expect to remain the same? Because I think that's important, especially for financial markets. And in that regard, I believe that whether we turn up blue or red, there's a couple of things that are going to remain the same. First of all, there is action that's going to come against the big tech companies. It's going to come for different reasons. The Democrats, they believe these are the bad guys with, international influence. The Republicans believe they're stamping out our content. But I think there is general convergence about the fact that some kind of action is going to come in for the big tech companies. So I think the FANG companies, which everyone's watching financially, will get impacted. Secondly, about this point on taking in more skilled labor, I'm not sure about that, because I think, again, over there's convergence about the fact that manufacturing has to be encouraged again in the US. That's something that Biden has come around to as well. There is a huge jobs crisis in the US, Kanchan. It's similar to India in the sense that those who have lost their jobs are mostly millennials. They're also the same people who are burdened with, student debts. So there is a lot of discomfort in that regard. And I think there is going to be emphasis on manufacturing. Third, I think there is generally, as I said earlier, a convergence about the fact that, there is going to be this sort of anti-China wave or vibe going for the Democrats or the Republicans. So trade is going to be colored by that. And the fourth big question is always money, Kanchan. So I think on that regard, all eyes will be on the Fed once this is done and dusted. The expectation from the market is that if the Democrats come into into power, there's a far bigger financial package coming in, perhaps $2 trillion. And that means a lot to every economy, not just the US. Whereas if it's the Republicans, it's a smaller, more modest $500 billion. So I think this will boil down to money. There is a lot of uncertainty in the system for sure. But for India, at this point, the short-term advantage or disadvantage is what happens with money coming into our stock markets. The longer term, as you said, of course, will dictate our trade ties. But I don't think we have much to worry on that account. We've had pretty smooth trade ties running so far, and that should likely continue, key trade agreement notwithstanding.
Thank you. We have Pramesha Saha, my colleague at ORF, who's joined in. She's a China expert. Dhruva, I just wanted a very quick comment from you on two things. One, Turkey post-elections, how does DC deal with it? Number two, if Biden wins the presidency and if there is a shift in Iran policy, where does it leave the Abrahamic Accords? Because Iran would want its pound of flesh too. So we are looking at a bit of a recreation of the mess which Trump tried to sort out.
Well, I think perhaps in that sense we overestimate the leverage the U.S. has in the Middle East and in West Asia. Very crudely, I don't follow it as closely as many of the other people in the roundtable, but the developments we've seen recently is a growing fault line effectively across the Gulf between, on the one hand, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel, and on the other hand, sort of a loose coalition of Turkey, Iran, on some issues, Qatar, working together, say on Syria and other places, although obviously both are complicated and have their differences. And what we've seen is the Trump administration throw its weight very clearly behind one side, which is the Saudis, Emiratis, and Israelis. Many people, and many Democrats, particularly on the Hill, do have their concerns about those three relationships, and that has to do with the settlement issue in Palestine with Israel, and I think something that doesn't get as much attention is the Yemen war and the Saudi and UAE role in prosecuting the Yemen war, which has faced a lot of criticism on the left in the U.S. So I think for those reasons, I think more than actually the tensions with Iran, where in some ways there's still not a lot of love for Iran or Turkey in Washington, in Turkey even less so perhaps in the U.S. These concerns about actions by the Netanyahu government and by the MBS and MBZ leaderships in Saudi Arabia, UAE will weigh more heavily on U.S. policy going forward, particularly should the Democrats win. But I suspect we'll still see a lot of criticism in the U.S. Congress on that front.
Kabir, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to make two very quick points. On Iran, we have to remember that if the Americans are planning to get back into the JCPOA with the Biden administration, the Iranians may well have a better negotiating deck of cards now because they did not exit the JCPOA, but the Americans did. So it's not necessary that it's going to be a breeze for the Biden administration to restart the Iranian deal. And then secondly, I also want to point out that with Turkey, it's not just geopolitical as far as the GCC is concerned. Turkey is fast becoming a big hub of political Islam as well. So the recent deal between Sudan and Israel to normalize relationship was because Israel wanted to dismantle Hamas ecosystems in Sudan. And over the past a week or so, a lot of Hamas members have actually shifted base to Turkey after Sudan cracked down after the normalization of the Israel agreement. Just 2 quick points.
Raji?
A very quick comment on I think Elizabeth and to some extent even Teresa talked about, for instance, to say that the Iran nuclear deal was not the perfect deal, but just good enough a deal in a sense. And I think that's the problem. The Iranians clearly understood that the Obama administration, the Secretary of State Kerry, they were so keen, and even to some extent the Europeans also were very keen on just having a deal than an ideal deal. And this was just a matter of buying time in a sense. As far as the Americans were concerned, I spoke to a lot of them as to saying that this is not the Iranians stand to benefit from the deal. So that's one part of the problem. But I think the Trump administration's opposition to the deal, the nuclear deal, is not just about the nuclear deal, but what kind of larger role that Iran plays in the region, its use of Hamas and the Hezbollahs and a whole lot of other things that come into play. And I think that's part of the opposition from the U.S. Government. But it's also to do with the fact that Iran's growing relations with both Russia and China have also been factors, I would think.
Thank you. Yeah, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on the nuclear deal. I just wanted to back you up there. And of course, the Trump administration's whole point about the nuclear deal was that it wasn't expansive enough and it covered too little. And it felt the administration felt that the deal should have been about so much more. And so I think the mistake they made was in walking out of a deal that didn't set out to cover these other areas. And so that's where we are now. And as you said, Kabir, the Iranians may decide that if a Biden administration wanted to join, they make it a bit harder for them. So it is a challenging situation. And I just had sort of an additional point here. I can't remember who brought up the H-1B visas, but it seems to me that this is a major point in U.S.-Indian relations, because it is known as the Indian visa, right? And without all these H-1B visa holders who come and staff American tech companies would be in big trouble. And I think in fact, I know they already are now with the H-1B visa ban. So it seems to me that this is something that could be used for political capital on the Indian side. What would America do without all these H-1B visa holders? It would lose its technological edge.
Thank you. We have Shruti Pandalai with us now. She's with IDSA, and Premesha also joined us. A quick question to you, Shruti. How do you see the great amount of activity and forward movement that has happened in the Indo-Pacific, on Quad, on the India-US fourth foundational agreement? All this, does it again move forward with equal speed, or will it slack off? And all this will, of course, be tied up with if Biden were to win, a Biden presidency's perception on China.
Right. Kanchandra, good evening. Thank you very much to ORF for inviting me to this conversation. I've been tuned in for a while, and it's great to hear and see all of you. I think it's for me today, this morning, when I opened the newspapers, one of the headlines in one of the leading dailies was the United States' anxiety. And for me, that, really brought home the message, especially in India, as to how far the India-United States relationship has come. We have like back-to-back coverage on news networks and so on and so forth. So as unclear as it is today in terms of where the election scenario is heading, I think the good news on the defense security cooperation front, especially bilaterally, and in the Indo-Pacific theater, where there has been both optics and substance. You could argue, you just mentioned the sort of BECA, the signing of the BECA in terms of the last foundational of the agreements. It is that, whether the Quad meeting happened in Tokyo or the in-person 2+2 dialogue in New Delhi, the optics mattered and there was substance. And I think there was unanimous agreement, irrespective of which side of the pond you are, that, this relationship has become quote-unquote foolproof. Having said that, I think the Indo-Pacific theater remains very important for both sides, because, and irrespective of which administration sort of we see in Washington, because as many of the analysts have pointed out, the Indo-US relationship, given the length that it has come, will sustain despite what or not, and Indo-Pacific theater becomes important. I think nuancing the discourse on our defense relationship will become very important, because what we've seen happen is sometimes the overburdening of expectations and how you sort of misinterpret the defense relationship. I think that's something that we'll be watching out very carefully, because we are going to see both sides choosing to cooperate on core security concerns. And for India, a degree of military dependence while aligning on specific issues remains central to its approach. So overselling the defense relationship without nuancing it will be detrimental. I think second, the China factor, and it's been discussed, and I think Dhruva put it very eloquently in the first half. But I think, while this has allowed for this convergence to deepen, I think what we have done in terms of both sides is, put the processes in place to institutionalize the relationship beyond the China question. And how we do that will become important, because I think Indrani wrote in the Times of India very recently that when you walk with a superpower, it's not easy, especially given that you're trying to choose your side. And second, you will have to jump through very many loops. And how we do that, will become important. So techno-nationalism, supply chains, how we're looking at capacity building, how we're reassuring allies, where are we showing alternative models in terms of connectivity and going beyond the rhetoric. I think all of this will become very important in the future.
Premisha, the China factor.
I think firstly, thank you for inviting me to speak in this discussion also. To follow from what Shruti said, I think even if we see recently the Pew Research Center also came out with a few statistics. In general, the American public opinion against China, there has been a rise in the negative opinion, be it by the way China has handled the pandemic, or even for its growing assertive actions, be it in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and in India's borders. So I think even if the Biden administration comes to power, these considerations have to be taken in, these points have to be taken into consideration. So even if they would, because in the past, as we see, Obama administration was mainly concerned with some sort of a constructive engagement with China. It was not a confrontational China policy. If you look at the rebalance or the Asia pivot policy that was followed by the Obama administration. That is the difference that lies in Trump administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. It is more of a calling out China or a confrontational China policy. So even for now, I think the Biden administration, considering the growing negative public opinion in the USA against China, will, even if they want or not want, they will have to follow a strict China policy. So I think in that there will be a continuity. And as far as even Shruti said, if we look at the Indo-Pacific strategy, I don't think there will be any marked difference no matter who comes to power. If the Trump administration comes, whether it will be a stronger Indo-Pacific strategy or a more stern policy towards China, that remains to be seen. Biden, I think, will try to correct a few flaws which to his administration, Trump has committed. For example, withdrawing from multilateral agreements, be it the climate change agreement or the TPP. I think these are the things which the Biden administration would want to rectify. In these kind of things, there will be differences. But in the broader China policy, Indo-Pacific policy, I don't think there will be a lot of difference, because even during his campaign, Biden has pointed out that he would also want a stern China policy. He would also want a strong China policy. He would also be calling out China. So I don't think there will be a very big difference or a departure from this that has been going on, given the current scenario.
Trisha, US, India, China. US tech, China tech, India tech. 5G and beyond. I mean, this is an election whose results were to impact on how the world of technology changes in terms of alignments, in terms of investments, in terms of ideas, in terms of moving shop floors. Do you see that happening now in case there's a Biden victory, or does it gather speed? How does it unfold?
So I do agree with everyone else's assessment that we won't see a market difference in US policy in relation to China, and that's true of tech as well. So, for instance, the series of executive orders and other measures that this administration has put forward on 5G, including the 5G clean networks concept, and generally its steps to root out Chinese companies from its 5G ecosystem and encouraging other countries to do so. That will likely continue, and not just because of US pressure, but because other countries are also seeing the risks of working with untrusted vendors. There's a broader coalescence of interests that is happening in any case that the election is unlikely to change. One area of further interest here is there's this concept of a digital quad emerging of India, Japan, Australia, and the US cooperating more on critical tech, including 5G, but also emerging tech like AI. And it would be interesting to see now whether once the election pressures have subsided, whether we'll see some productive measures coming out here. There was talk of coalition of democracies not too long ago on 5G, but we haven't seen much progress on that. So perhaps we'll see that also growing. Yes, there's a lot to look out for in this space.
Thank you, Trisha. Shubhola, coalition of democracies, and I have been using the phrase the Great Wall of Democracies. Both you and Dhruva, please feel free to come in on this. Does that happen after the elections? Do you see any chance of that happening vis-a-vis China?
I think the the Communist Party of China has done one thing in the world, and that is refocus capital's attentions on how new cooperation can take hold. By having picked a fight across so many geographies and so many issues, including radical economic disruption, democratic capitals especially are going to have to come up with a national interest thesis that is based on trust. And trust between democracies that support the rule of law and a capitalist model are ones that I think are just going to naturally gravitate more toward each other. Now, what that means in terms of cooperation, I think, is yet to be defined. I do believe that bilateral negotiations between capitals will intensify. I think that large global projects of trading, of big trade deals, will be even more difficult to accomplish, particularly as the impact of AI and technology take hold in the workforces of countries around the world. But the idea that a market-based democratic capitalist system that is a large byproduct of the post-Cold War era would somehow be bought by the Chinese state-owned one model is certainly not an attractive one. Where I think the competition would be most fierce will be among emerging economies, low-income economies, which have really a decision point to make about whether they return to a model that is about long-term economic development through the rule of law, market economics, and the democratic model, or whether their leadership will take a short-term deal for a long-term lease under a Chinese authoritarian model of development. And that'll be a defining issue in much of the Indo-Pacific and much of Africa. And I think, I'd like to go back to, I think what Raji had mentioned earlier, democracy may not be the most clean model, but it certainly is the most efficient model in the long term, in the sense that it provides more stability. Authoritarian models tend to have less disruption, but when they change heavily and with great cost. So it'll be interesting to see how all that plays out, Kanchan. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Dhruva, would you like to weigh in on that?
I mean, I concur with everything that's been said, but a few things to keep in mind. I think even if the language on democracy differs considerably between Trump and Biden, the reality is that the U.S. and others are moving towards a more like-minded coalitions on international issues. And just to give a few examples, just under Trump, and we've seen this happen in the last few months, it's not just the Quad, which has sort of got back together at a more senior level, the Malabar exercises, which are ongoing right now, representing a military aspect to the quadrilateral cooperation, but also on coronavirus pandemic coordination. We've seen a sort of so-called Quad Plus format emerge. We've seen on technology, on artificial intelligence and 5G, emerging cooperation amongst democracies. talk of an expanded G7. Trump openly spoke about inviting India, South Korea, Australia, amongst others, to a G7 summit. We could see that happen if he, for example, if he were to be re-elected. And yet, on the Democratic side, we've seen Biden speak at length about organizing a summit of democracies. So again, no, I think the emphasis will be very different. What exactly that means in terms of cooperation will be different. But the fact is, democratic cooperation is now back in vogue, thanks in large part to China's rise in behavior.
Thank you. Now, the other thing which, sorry.
Kanchan, can I just come in here for a couple of seconds?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. No, absolutely. I agree with the coalition of democracies, arc of democracies, all of that different formulations. But I also I agree with Dhruva. I think we could look at more as a coalition of like-minded partners, because then you do expand the number of countries that you can engage with who may not strictly have the best form of democracy. Countries like Vietnam, if you want to engage, or any number of other countries in the larger Indo-Pacific region, if you want to. So I would think a coalition of like-minded partners make it slightly more inclusive in nature, whether you want to collaborate on critical tech, tech collaboration with especially some of the smaller developing countries and so on and so forth, or even on maritime security, monitoring the maritime spaces in the Indo-Pacific. So there are a number of issues on which you can bring in a coalition, but I think coalition of democracies may limit some of the countries. So I think having a coalition of like-minded partners would be somewhat more inclusive. You couldn't bring in a number of other countries in a sense. So I think so I think you are going to see many more trilaterals and other forms of minilaterals taking shape in the region, precisely because you are trying to create this groups of like-minded partners in a sense. Just want to button with that.
Okay, I mean something, and this is without wanting to hyphenate countries. Something which also excites people at large. Would we see any change in policy, in American policy towards India's western region, Afghanistan, Pakistan? And if that were to happen, how would it unfold? I mean, President Trump, his attempt to strike a deal with the Taliban, I don't think it has gone very well. It doesn't take Afghanistan anywhere near to being a secure, peaceful country. And if the Democrats were to come, would that approach change? Wouldn't it change? Shruti, you could begin. And then both Teresa, Elizabeth, Raji, Shubhola, anybody. Please feel, Kabir, please feel free to chip in.
Kanchan,
go ahead.
Can you hear me? Am I audible? Oh,
yeah, please.
Okay. I think Kabir is the in-house expert on this, but I do think if you look at the statements that have come out, especially whether during the Biden administration, campaign, I think one of the things that stood out, especially from the Indian point of view, was very tough talk on Pakistan and cross-border terrorism and so on and so forth. But the writing also reflected a considerable anxiety on if Indian interests would be compromised in the larger game for Afghanistan. So I think that the jury is out on how that pans out, considering we ourselves are still deciding on how we are, what kind of role we are going to play in the larger question of Afghanistan. Having said that, I think there have been reasonable comments which have been made in support for India, even by during the Biden campaign, particularly saying that any form of cross-border sort of terrorism will not be tolerated and there will be a cost attached to it. So I think at that level, whether it is Biden or Trump, that sort of assurance stays. Of course, how that sort of turns out in terms of larger trade-offs for when domestic US concerns become primary remains to be seen.
Kabir?
I think it's whether it's Biden or Trump that comes into the White House after this, Afghanistan is going to be one of the main and serious challenges that they have to take care of, and that this includes Trump, who's signed the deal with the Taliban, which is a withdrawal deal and not a peace deal, considering the violence we are seeing in Afghanistan at the moment. I think what has happened in the past 2 months, at least, because the Trump administration has been busy preparing for the elections and so on and so forth, they've given Ambassador Khalilzad a fair bit of leeway on how he would want to, place America's hand over the intra-Afghan dialogue, and the intra-Afghan dialogue is not going well. Without a successful intra-Afghan dialogue, which is facing a lot of concern between the Taliban and the Afghan leadership over theological issues, over ideological issues, and what a culminative government system would look like, there is going to be very little the Americans can do beyond this point. But the Americans signed a deal with the Taliban to leave Afghanistan in the middle of next year. So whether it's Biden or Trump, I think that will happen. The concerns are right now that the Americans are also, along with the allies, are also planning to cut funding to Afghanistan, which is going to be catastrophic at some level, in my opinion. And finally, as far as India is concerned, I think on gaining a very strong foothold in around the Afghan negotiations, I think India has missed that bus. It is doing what it can do in the current scenario and situation. We've seen a steady stream of Afghan leaders coming to Delhi in the past month or so, sort of a Northern Alliance alumni meet kind of thing. But to what end that is, I'm sure there is some end to it. It's not just suddenly they decided to invite all of these sort of local leaders. In 2017, even the Indian ambassador in Kabul met Hekmatyar. So whether all this is leading to somewhere as far as India's Afghan policy is concerned, I'm not sure yet. But India's Afghan policy is very confused at the moment. And that confusion is seen as a regional weakness by the American administration, and it's up to New Delhi predominantly to decide what it wants to do. For whether it's Biden or Trump, Afghanistan is going to be a very significant challenge in 2021. Violence is going up significantly, and the Taliban is in a stronger position than the Afghan government at the moment.
Thank you. Teresa and Elizabeth, any view from Europe on this aspect? Shubola, please free to chip in also.
Okay, I can make a quick comment because I know this is Kabir's lane. I don't want to go into his lane, and that's excellent analysis. I would just say in Europe now we're undergoing a lot of Islamic terrorism, and I think that looking with strategic foresight, this could be a problem for Europe because we've seen the 2 attacks in France recently. But this narrative about Xinjiang, this could change Europe's perception of China's role in Xinjiang. That's something like on the horizon, but that's something that has come to my mind. And just to pick up an earlier point about Huawei from the previous run, I have to say that Trump's reversal on ZTE, this kind of poisoned the waters in Europe because no one really wants to take a position on Huawei because they're afraid that Trump might do a flip-flop. So I think the Trump administration's reversal on first banning and then accepting ZTE or ZTE, it's a huge problem for Europeans. And then also the battle of the bottom. We think of Huawei, but also the battle of the bottom for the underwater cables. We're seeing, Sweden sold their underwater cables to Huawei. So since December 2019, the European Commission announced that they will now be geopolitical because before then, they only looked at the world through an economic lens. So you can't just go from, okay, now we're going to be geopolitical overnight and build geopolitical muscle. So I find it very difficult for a lot of bureaucrats to start thinking geopolitically. And it's much easier to trade and not think of the implications of these trade deals in a geopolitical sense. So I just want to highlight those points. But we are seeing, because Europe has absolutely no choice, they must think geopolitically. All right.
Thank you. Shubola?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that previous comment a little bit. It's China's economic policy through its data and its resources companies that have been creating huge problems, including in the Indian near neighborhood. When you think of the Belt and Road Initiative, it aligns well with Pakistan's policy of strategic depth in Afghanistan to destabilize India, to create a strategic buffer, if not in geography, but certainly in security risk. And I think that, I was very encouraged in the early days of the Trump administration, when on New Year's Day, President Trump seemed to have articulated the threat that the Pakistani deep state poses to Afghan stability, to regional stability, to the concept of the promotion of terror. But sadly, I think, as Kabir had so nicely articulated, it resulted in a withdrawal deal rather than a reconciliation deal. If there is ever going to be a deal to be made for the peace of Afghanistan, especially in the context of the bloodshed we've seen in Kabul University in the last days, it will have to be with Pakistan stopping its policy of state terror as statecraft. And the real negotiation that needs to be held is with Islamabad. And the West needs to consider its alliances with Islamabad through the prism of how it has not been a reliable security partner in Afghanistan and in the region. It has not been a reliable partner in the war against terror and the financing of terror. And it has not been a good economic partner in its partnership with Beijing. And until that is resolved, then I think Afghanistan will continue to be a problem for neighbors that are looking for a long-term stability that will see the prosperity of the Afghan people first, the success of Afghan women and girls first, and then the remarkable opportunities of trade that actually naturally exist in the region that are being held back by Pakistan's belligerence. So forgive me for being a bit blunt about it, but after 20 years on the war on terror, you'll forgive me for being a bit frustrated that it still takes agents like Zalmay Khalilzad. It still hasn't really punctured through what the objective needs to be for stability in Afghanistan.
Trisha, coming back to the question of technology, do you see any reshaping of US policy happening after the elections that will impact India in a particular manner as far as technology is concerned?
One potential area of friction that may re-emerge once the election is data protection, because over the last few years, the Trump administration has stressed on the free flow of data and how India's data protection legislation threatens this free flow. That has quietened down a little over the past few months, but I wonder if once the election's over, once things are a little more settled, if this issue might re-emerge as a point of contention between India and the US. Yeah, that said, there isn't honestly much difference between India and the US when it comes to data, because although the US policy may not say it in name, cyber sovereignty is something that's kind of central to most countries' digital policies. The question is, it's because data legislation threatens the dominance that a lot of US tech companies have in this space. So again, yeah, this would be an area that may become a little more thorny once the election is over.
Returning to Indo-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific issue and the sudden burst of energy which we have seen in the last few months on realignments happening in the zone, the minilaterals, the manner in which Japan was very active in pushing for the Quad's formalization, Australia's role. How does all this get impacted? Pramesha and then Shruti, maybe.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, especially after the wave of the pandemic, we are seeing, though this was, I should not categorize it as a wave of the pandemic, we have been seeing a proliferation of plurilaterals and unilaterals. And I think that as a working within a minilateral setup is much easier than a multilateral setup, because you have a limited number of partners And mostly it's the like-minded country setup mindset which bring you together, as Raji very rightly pointed out. And it is much more focus and target oriented. So I think in general that if we look at that scenario, and besides that, I think one thing which uh, because of Trump administration hardening of China policy, we also see countries like Japan, countries like Australia reforming or rethinking their China policy as well. For Australia, this was tough because China is their leading trading partner and USA is their age-old security ally. So they have always maintained a sort of a balancing approach. But now we see a rethinking of China policy. We see also with them probing the origin of the coronavirus and also the stern stand on 5G. We see a lot of reforming in the terms of Australian policy as well. So these kind of things also, I think the acceptance of a stronger China policy from the type of like-minded countries has also pushed for such unilateral platforms. But if we look at, say, a different geography, if we look at even Southeast Asian countries, uh, we also see an increasing acceptance from their end towards unilaterals. Countries like Vietnam have proposed that they would also want to work on a unilateral platform. Countries like Indonesia, which has been so sensitive towards sovereignty, and they have followed a non-aligned foreign policy structure, free and active foreign policy thinking, are also open now to trilaterals. We see a revamping of the India, Indonesia, Australia trilateral. There is also a proposal of a India, Japan, Indonesia trilateral or such kind of initiatives. So there has been a reform in the thinking of countries in general towards the unilaterals and trilaterals. And as far as the formalization of the Quad is concerned, I think that's a very welcome move. And there was a lot of skepticism in the minds of many with regard to whether Quad, what is the future of the quadrilateral. It was not even taking up to the level of ministerial meetings, but now given that it has been elevated to ministerial meetings and also through the militarization of the Quad, we are seeing through the Malabar exercises. I think these are all welcome moves, and these obviously has a China factor underlying. That is the main reason, I think, in my opinion, and it
Thank
should
you.
continue
Shruti?
because given that
Sorry.
getting back with the allies, these kind of many should continue.
Shruti?
Okay, just to quickly add on to, I think, Richa's point, I think when we're, Indo-Pacific is the theater where the tech conversation is also picking up very much. But, from the Indian point of view, when you were asking the question of, I think we have to acknowledge that, despite a change in administration, the fact remains that as we have discussed in many forums earlier, like the India Trilateral Forum, and there was a very interesting conversation on technology, where I think there was a consensus in the room that India will be pulled in different directions. And even beyond tech, there will be a question on how like-minded democratic countries achieve this resilience that we talk about, especially in the technology domain. So you diversify, create sort of better or smarter investment screening mechanisms. How do you foster innovation? Or there is, of course, the other end of the spectrum where you become more close to trade, investment, tech, people, etc. So I think that fine balance of where you land on the spectrum is going to be something that we're going to have to think about. To come quickly to the question of, as Pramesha very nicely put it, that, we have seen the proliferation of a lot of these minilateral, plurilateral platforms in the recent past. And I think the Indo-Pacific theater gains from that because what you need is right now a balance. So, the Quad had become such a behemoth in everyone's head that now when it's actually been actualized and you've seen the Malabar exercises happen, I think after that big storm, it seems to be a sudden lull where, the acceptance has come about. And I think that's a positive sign. But what it also tells you is that as we go forward, that the Quad will have to have a definitive blueprint. So when I'm talking about a balance, you have the security concern has been handled, but the Quad Plus format sort of looks after with this network of relationships other things where the frictions on trade, the frictions on technology, the frictions on connectivity, and how do we reconcile that. Everyone talks about ASEAN centrality, but the fact remains that Southeast Asia has had looks at the question of ASEAN centrality also very critically. If you see when the United States came out with its statement on the South China Sea, a lot of them welcomed it as a group, but if you saw how they reacted individually, no one was willing to sort of hedge their bet. So I think it's a delicate balance, but yes, I think the trust is building. Everyone understands that in the absence of protection from the United States, if we each for its own and institutional hedging, I think it's a term that Jeff had sort of coined in one of his pieces, is something that we're going to see play out a lot more in this theater.
Thank you. Raji, how will it impact Taiwan in terms of its security vis-a-vis China? If there is a change in the presidency, what does it mean for Taiwan, for the extended Southeastern Asia?
No, I was just thinking about that particular point, whether to kind of have raised along with the Indo-Pacific. So I think on the one hand, you do see both Trump and Biden during their campaign days have had a sort of a competitive thing to see who's going to be more hardline on China, who's going to be who's going to be harsher on China. So that particular aspect did come out. But certainly with a Biden administration, there is going to be change in the rhetoric, change in the style of working, and so on and so forth. So I think there is going to be some more breathing space, some maneuverability that is going to be maneuverable space available for China in a sense, if it is a Biden administration. Even though they both might have the same approach to China, I think there is some bit of the style difference will make a difference in the overall thing. But I think having said that, I think that's where whether a Biden administration would they go one step further in sort of engaging in a closer fashion with countries like Taiwan, for instance. How would that pan out? Because if you look at the Trump administration, I think that's been something that has been remarkable. Whether it is directly, confronting China in like no other presidents have done. The previous presidents have recognized this challenge of what China's rise mean, but at the same time they have been hesitant in pushing their limits to confronting China. So there has always been that particular factor. But Trump, in that sense, was very clear about how you need to confront China in a straightforward fashion, and there is no mincing on. And for that, I think in that perspective, when he looked at even India, for instance, from a strategic perspective, even while generally the allies have been treated shabbily and so on and so forth, and Trump is generally seen as a transactional president, but the manner in which he did nurture the relationship with India to a large extent has been strategic in nature. If it was a purely transactional relationship, I think we would have hit the ground really badly because there are a lot of problems on the visa front, on the economic issues, and so on and so forth. So I think he did have the China factor coming play a major role in looking at other aspects as well. Taiwan, I think the manner, again, the number of officials, the U.S. Trump administration officials who have traveled to Taiwan in the last few months, I haven't seen that in a very long time. So I think he has been able to push the limits of the Taiwan engagement like none of the other recent presidents have done. So I think there is that difference, and I don't see that much of a pushing the limits if it were a Biden administration. There will be some sort of a caution. Yeah.
So basically, Beijing didn't see Trump as a pushover, but if the presidency were to change after the elections, it may be seen as that Beijing can once again start pushing the envelope and test the limits. Teresa, you wanted to come in on this?
Teresa,
Sorry,
you
need
muted.
to unmute yourself.
In regard to Taiwan, of course, Europe is very concerned about what the situation, how it's evolving. We've seen in the past, everyone was very fearful to even go to like the Taiwan reception, the annual National Day reception. But this year we saw at the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, tweeted, "Thank you, Taiwan, for the masks." So she acknowledged, Taiwan's help at a very difficult time in Europe, whereas China was, this so-called mass diplomacy was kind of unveiling that China was conflating aid with products and gave very, very low quality products, or I mean, the Europeans purchased very low quality goods, and the Europeans, on the other hand, had helped China a great deal. They sent tons of PPE to China in the early days of the crisis in Wuhan. So I think that this signaling that they really care about Taiwan is something that really grates in the EU-China relationship. But I think that Europeans also, after what's happened in Hong Kong, they're very, very concerned about the impact on Taiwan. What can they do about that? That remains to be seen, because with 27 member states, it's very difficult. We saw with Hong Kong that they couldn't even come up with any sort of concrete action. They just, used rhetoric, but no real, nothing was put on the table. Only one country of the 27 EU member states, Sweden, has even suggested maybe sanctions on China because of what happened in Hong Kong. And so I think that if Beijing is testing the waters to see international response, by poking and prodding and seeing what happens with Hong Kong, I think the Europeans really, kind of gave them the idea that there wouldn't be much that they would be able to do. So the real players in all of this is pretty much the United States. But I want to pick up on one earlier point about Japan, because the Trump administration has largely been rather in some respects, aloof towards Europe. Japan has kind of filled this vacuum. They've been very active in cultivating European response. So they have the connectivity strategy together, which is very important. Not a lot has happened, but it was really because of Abe really pushing hard to get that with the previous Commission President Juncker. And that can be developed. I mean, they've got the strategy, it's there. They need to work on it. But also this kind of variable geometry, because with 27 EU member states, it's very difficult. China has made some clever investments. They have cultivated various member states, for example, Hungary, that will block and water down anything the EU tries to do. So the only way around this is this kind of what we describe as variable geometry. So you get like-minded groups within the EU to do things in the Indo-Pacific or even in regard to Taiwan. So that's the only way forward, I think, because China, I have to, chapeau, they're very good strategists, and they've been able to pretty much freeze a lot of EU policymaking. And this is the one workaround. And Japan has been working very closely with the EU on this. So I think that's a positive development.
Thank you. Pramesha, you wanted to comment on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to make one point on the trilaterals. I think besides even security, we are seeing a lot of how these trilateral frameworks are working in other spheres as well. So just connectivity also, and also we see at like infrastructure development, we are seeing alternative supply chain networks as well. So I think this line is much, it's a safer bet also to look at issues beyond security through these trilateral frameworks. And I think even if, as Raji rightly pointed out, that we might see a bit of caution in the Biden administration when it kind of pursues these kind of policies, but trilateral framework would be a safer bet because they are looking at areas beyond security as well. Like we see a Japan, Australia, US investing together for undersea cable in Pulau, or even the electrification project that is happening in Papua, and also the supply chain networks. I think these areas work might continue. It's remains to be seen if the Biden administration is going to pursue this or not, but it is a much safer line of work if one has to continue with such trilateral frameworks also.
Thank you. Raji?
Yes. Just a couple of quick thoughts on the points on the Europe, the Indo-Pacific, Europe-China angle in a sense. I think Europe has gone back and forth, at least individual countries have gone back and forth when it comes to China factor, the Huawei, the kind of decisions, that have been taken, and then undo the decisions, do again the decisions. But most recently, I was kind of very, very surprised, and I don't know if, Elizabeth is not here, but maybe Teresa. France is trying to enter into a cooperation with China on nuclear. Civil nuclear cooperation, but the fact is that this was a conversation that was started 2018, but now they want to pick it at this point of time. I don't know. This seems to be like, oh, wow, it's a perfect time. I thought COVID and China has pushed a lot of the Indo-Pacific countries together with Europe, with the US and so on and so forth. But some of the European countries kind of throw a bit of sort of surprises from time to time. Just a month or 2 months ago, Germany moved the Taiwanese flag from their parliament. So things, Europe has not really given us a very clear picture as to where does it stand when it comes to China. Clearly, the economic angle is something that practically the whole world is working with. But at the same time, if we have to be able to confront China where it really matters, we have to take conscious decision among the like-minded partners, even though sometimes painful decisions, but painful decision to consciously move away from China, create sort of larger collaboration among like-minded partners. So that's Europe does throw me a lot of surprises from time to time. So I'm not sure where exactly. Yeah.
I can just pick up on your point really quickly. I would agree with you. It's a 27 member states, and you have some in the camp and some not. And depending on the topic, the subject, you would really be surprised. For example, with the United Nations statement. So you had countries not just in the East, but also in the West, North, South. I mean, it was all a mixed bag. So there's no real clarity. And because the largest trade partner is Germany, 40% of their exports. So if you take the next 5 EU member states, it doesn't even equal what Germany's trade is with China. So you can't say this, but it's true. Germany tends to really run the China policy. And I remember when I moved from Beijing to Brussels, this was back in 2007, and I was at one of these big annual think tank conferences for European think tanks, and a young German woman sat on the stage and said, I think German should just run China policy for the EU, and she at least blushed. But they were saying this in 2007, but I think the reality is they pretty much do. Because if you look at the language, for example, systemic rival, that language was directly lifted from the German BDI report. So the Confederation of German Industry wrote a paper 2 years ago complaining because China had lost the support of German industry. And so China's been very careful to kind of cultivate German industry because they know that that's the country that the decisions are made. And so we saw once the pandemic was under control in China, not one but two private chartered planes were sent to China from Germany. And initially they approached Europe saying, oh, we want Europeans to come over and invest in China. And then they changed it and said, no, just Germans. So the German businessmen, great, they all went. They had 2 planefuls of German business people that went. And inside the Berlin policy bubble, they didn't realize how much anger this created among the other EU member states. So China also plays that game of divide and rule, but since it's so clear that Germany is the leader, they just cultivate them. And so, these people are in top positions and they can shape policy. And I think Germany is the key question. Now we have Merkel, who for 15 years, she doesn't want to say, wow, I was wrong on China. So I think the position will stay until she's gone. And the next question is, who is the next leader? So it's a complicated field, but I think that the one thing about COVID-19, so you had a lead opinion, you can make these nice backroom deals, business deals with German industry in China, but now everyone is at home. I'm in my basement bunker, and everyone in Europe is under like a lockdown 2, Germany lockdown light, but the public, in a democracy, the politicians have to respond. So the one thing about COVID-19, everybody in Europe talks about China now. And so this has had an amazing effect on focusing the public's mind about the future of China. So I think politicians will be responding and we'll see more pressure. Germany is not monolithic. It's a very complicated landscape politically, but we'll see how the future, how it unfolds. But there's no time, sorry.
We are now sort of running out of time, and coming back to who will be the next president. We can worry about who will succeed Mrs. Merkel later on. Shubola, I will let you have the last word on US elections 2020. Your view, sitting there, how do you see this election playing out finally in terms of how it impacts America, how it impacts Europe, how it impacts the world, and how it impacts US-India relations? And then we break up for this day.
Well, that's a very big assignment, and thank you, Kanchan, for it. I'm also not confident that this will be the last word on so many topics, and that might be the last word. some big things that maybe I can from Canada draw from this, because in Canada we obviously look at American politics very carefully. The U.S. is a very big part of Canada's strategic position in the world. It's a security partner, an economic partner. What happens in all parts of America matter. The first big takeaway is I would focus on the resilience of the U.S. Constitution. A lot of people warned mass riots on the streets, big violence, lots of disruptions to voting on election day. That ultimately didn't come to pass. There has been violence, there has been issues, but not at the scale that the social media and much of the international commentariat had concluded was going to happen. And the American Constitution is a very resilient document. It is an experienced democracy, and it'll be interesting to see how they navigate these very tense issues over the next week or so. Item number 2, I think that, and I don't know if this is something that I've learned through osmosis, through scanning social media over the last little while, but the main losers in this election are the international press, the national press, and big technology, social media. Yet again, they have miscalculated what the real sentiments of real people are, and they have caricatured the earnest concerns of ordinary people into polarized positions in globalized debates, extrapolating from one cultural context into another, the context of one nation's issues into another nation's issues. That has to stop, because I think ultimately it is hurting our capacity to analyze the real facts hidden behind the advent of our times. Particularly, we see in the Democratic Party that they won more white male voters. We see in the Republican Party under Donald J. Trump that he won more black, more Hispanic voters, which is exactly the opposite of what most of the commentary would have led you to believe. And third, in the context of the US-India relationship, in fact, American relations with others around the world, this narrowing objective of acting in national interests, this emergence of nationalism informed by populism, need not be a bad thing for the world. It is definitely a new thing, but I think that what it does create an opportunity for is to reset many of the post-war relationships that emerged after the Second World War and were defined through the Cold War into new and contemporary opportunities, with nations like India really beginning to emerge in their own right and become different types of partners for the Indo-Pacific era to come. So I'm a bit more optimistic about what all this portends than I think most would be. And I hope, Kanchan, it rises to the occasion of what you've assigned me to try and do here.
Thank you. And thank you everybody who joined us for this evening's, or rather this evening over here in India, morning in America, and Europe too. Thank you for joining us. It was an exciting discussion. A lot was, a lot of ideas were exchanged, and I think which is good, because this is an election which is important, and we saw this election as 2020 in many ways redefining 2021 for the world, and if it's redefining it for the world, then also for India. And to that extent, I think we had a fruitful discussion. And thank you once again for joining us. And thank you all the viewers who joined us for this discussion.
Thank you. It was great seeing you all. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you very much.